It's fun having Hillel as an opening act. I wasn't really thinking about swearing, but shit, I mean, I don't know. Bring it. As Jenny says, my name is Jay Greene. I write for CNET. Before that, I was the Seattle Bureau Chief for Business Week for about a decade. In between those two jobs, I wrote a book about design and innovation. It's up there, it's right here, called Design is How It Works. Penguin released it last year. I'm a little reluctant to say last year because it makes it sound old, not current. But that said, just a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese language version came out, so it's at least current for a few billion people. So I'm happy about that. You know, one of the great things about being a journalist is the opportunity to write about experiences that most folks don't get the opportunity to go through. And as I worked on the book, I knew really early on that I wanted to line up some of these anecdotes because I knew they'd make for great storytelling and it'd be fun and all that. And so as I worked on the book, one of the first companies I knew I wanted to focus on was Porsche. And so when I chatted with my contact at Porsche, I told him I wanted to speak with executives and designers and engineers and really try and understand the process. But then I also said, I wanted to experience driving a Porsche. And he got my drift pretty quickly. And he said, well, when I came to Germany, if I could set aside maybe just a little extra time, he suggested maybe I should go up to Leipzig. And in Leipzig, Porsche has a test track. And he said, if I could just find that time, I get the chance to drive a 911 Carrera S around that track really, really fast. And so on the other end of the phone, here's my most professional voice saying, thanks so much. It sounds like a terrific opportunity. And of course, what he couldn't see is me on the other end of the phone doing the Snoopy dance, pumping my fists. So a few months later, I was in Leipzig. Oh no, what just happened there? Uh-oh. God, I was setting that up so well, too. How do I do this? Let's see. Any tech person want to help me? Oh, hello, that's great. Just hit that one instead. There you go.
The right arrow.
There you go. All right. So I was sitting in Leipzig, and nope, that wasn't the right one. You said right arrow. Down arrow?
What the hell it's doing?
Oh, on the last slide.
Oh, smarties.
See, I'm a journalist. I'm not an engineer. It's about the experience.
It's
it wasn't design. Yeah, exactly.
Not C++.
Okay, so there you go. So I always drove that car. And sitting right next to the race instructor, a guy named Guido Majewski, who shot that photo. And I got to tell you, I was driving around and I was flying on this track. And about after a half dozen laps or so, I was feeling a bit woozy, like I'd been on a roller coaster one too many times. But I got to tell you, it was a hoot. It was an amazing experience pushing that car, as hard as I could, or at least as hard as I dared. So let's bring that back to my book for a second. But why does that matter, right? I mean, how does it relate to design? So I want to ask you to think just for a second about the title of my book. It's Design is How It Works. And so pick up maybe on a little theme that Hillel has. It's actually a quote from Steve Jobs. So he talked about design, and he said, most people make the mistake of thinking design is what it looks like. People think it's this veneer that designers are handed this box and told, make it look good. That's not what we think design is. It's not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works. And what Jobs is really saying, and Hillel got at this really well, most companies don't understand design. They think it's merely the glossy sheen that gets put on at the end of the process. That's not the way Apple thinks about design, or any of the other companies I focus on in my book. Aesthetics are important. But to all these companies, design is about the experience consumers have with their products. And so let's think about that in the context of Porsche. For my money, it'd be hard to find a more beautiful car than the 911. And I'm kind of partial to the new 911 Targa, but I got to say some of those 1970s, vintage 911s are pretty sweet too. But Porsche doesn't think of design as merely the body they put on top of their cars. For Porsche, design is about the sound that the engine makes, or even the doors closing. And they actually have a lab in Wiesack, which is just north of Stuttgart, where they're based, where they test sound possibilities, and they pick the one that they think is just right. And they fret over dashboard instrumentation to make sure that all the gauges are in just the right place. The list goes on, from braking systems to aerodynamics. Individually, they all may seem like little fetishes, but collectively, that focus is what makes a Porsche a Porsche. Nothing comes by accident. And so, drivers get the experience I got, even when they're tooling around town. The car does exactly what drivers expect of it. And so it's a lesson I would say too few companies really appreciate. And yet, I think it's becoming more and more important. I'd argue that design is really one of the handful of critical business strategies in the 21st century. And that's because the economy continues to become global. Commoditization is happening on a broad scale, and companies are learning that competing just on cost alone is a dangerous game. It's easy to replicate minor breakthroughs in basic design. The companies that I try to focus on in my book are the ones that figured out how to compete by creating better experiences through design. And that pays off in higher margins, and it pays off in better sales, and really, most importantly, it pays off in return business. And so, executives and managers are figuring this out, and Hillel talked about this too, but often they aren't quite sure where to start. And I'll tell you, the big reason for that is that most of the guys in the corner offices, and women, although there are probably fewer of them, sadly, but most of them rise up through the finance ranks. Right? They've gone to business school and picked up their MBAs, right? And they're trained in Six Sigma, right? And benchmarking manufacturing processes and supply chain operations, right? That's their world. And design doesn't lend itself to those kind of metrics. I was actually just at Microsoft last week talking with somebody for an article, and I talked to the UX designer here, and he was going through his presentation. He kind of came across this slide that I just loved. It said, "How do you spec love?" That was really great, right? The answer is you can't. Right? There's some folks out there who try to measure cost per designer and compare that to rivals, and it's painfully imprecise, but really more important, it's not really relevant, right? The truth is that the most innovative companies don't even try to benchmark their design processes. They recognize that great design boosts costs, and they roll with it, knowing that great design also boosts sales, and most important, it boosts customer loyalty. And so that's really why I wrote the book, right? I wanted to show how great companies succeed using design. The metrics might not be there, but the business success of the companies I write about proves that design is a crucial competitive advantage for any company. And so the idea for my book, it came from a piece I wrote from Business Week a few years ago on Bang & Olufsen, a high-end Danish consumer electronics company. They make beautiful products, and some of them are so gorgeous they hang in the Museum of Modern Art. The Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. So that's probably their most iconic product. A beautiful CD player. I love that thing. About 6 years ago, I met with B&O's chief technology officer at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, and he told me about the company's design process, and it was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. As beautiful as its products are, the company has no designers on staff, not one. It contracts out the fit and finish of every product because it doesn't want designers to be influenced by office politics, right? It wants them to be independent to make the right decision for the product, and it gives them complete control over the products. So a B&O engineer, for example, can't demand a shortcut that might otherwise corrupt that designer's vision. I thought that would make for a great article, so I pitched it to the bosses, and 2 months later I was on a plane to Copenhagen, and then on a little plane to Karup, and then I took a 90-minute drive to a little town called Struer, which is in the fjords of western Denmark, and that's where Bang & Olufsen's based. And I came back and I wrote the story. It was pretty well received, and so much so that Penguin's business book division portfolio emailed me and said I should write a book. But here's the thing. The article wasn't entirely right. I was, and I still am, smitten with B&O's products. And maybe someday if my book sells really well, I'll buy myself that. Maybe the Chinese can go buy a bunch of copies of it. I'd just take 1% of that population. I think that thing is beautiful. It's an $1,100 phone, the Beocom 2. I just love that thing. But really, beauty is only part of the puzzle, right? It sure helps get people notice the product, right? But it doesn't. But if the product itself doesn't deliver experiences consumers crave, right, the bond never materializes, and the product never goes anywhere. And the fact is, Bang & Olufsen's actually struggled over the last several years. So as I worked on my book, I went back to Struer, and I wanted to speak with folks to figure out what happened. And it turns out their designers are terrific at making stereo gear and TVs and phones look beautiful. but consumer electronics are becoming more and more interactive. So rather than just putting, a CD in a CD player and listening to the whole album, right? People want to, compile playlists on the fly, and B&O wasn't very good at that. And so I'll show you one of their devices, which I think is really interesting. This is their first mobile phone. It's called the Serene. It was $1,200. And that rotary keypad, I think, looks great, right? But in an era of texting and mobile email, that thing's just brutal to use, right? And the product went nowhere, right? It looks just terrific. It didn't sell at all. I mean, maybe $1,200. It was a little rich too, but that's B&O. It went nowhere. So really, this book became my odyssey. I'm not a designer. It became my odyssey to kind of figure out where B&O slipped up. So when I was in Denmark visiting them, I also visited Lego. And Lego has a fairly rigid design process with specific steps for products that they need to go through to move on to the next stage of development. And that's because only 7 years ago, Lego was hemorrhaging cash. It was doing really poorly. And it was in large part because Lego left their designers to their own devices. And that was because Lego at that point was focusing on TV production and amusement parks. And left to their own devices, those designers conjured up these really complex designs that required the development of a whole bunch of new bricks and doors and helmets and all those little components that fill up the Lego boxes. And the number of components rose from 7,000 to 12,000. And of course, supply costs went through the roof. But maybe more interestingly, the designs didn't resonate with kids, right? They were kind of artsy and too clever by half. So let me show you this. This is a fire truck in the Lego City line in 2001, and it looks like a futuristic hot rod, right? I mean, it was totally cool to the adults, and the kids hated it. The model bombed. And so things changed when Lego started putting constraints on designers. Now, that might sound like a little bit of heresy here, but the company started forcing designers to follow a formalized design process, from ideation to prototyping to manufacturing, with a whole bunch of steps in between that I'm leaving out. What's more, the company reduced the number of those components back down to around 7,000. And with those constraints, Lego came up with a new fire truck in 2005. And it kind of looks like a fire truck, doesn't it? Kids loved it. And in fact, the Lego City line, which this is part of, is once again one of the biggest pieces of the company's business. And Lego became one of the most profitable toy companies in the world. And the point here isn't to say that companies need to constrain designers. In fact, the opposite can work too. So let me talk about another company in my book that's really thrived with what I call a freeform focus on design. It's a small company called Ace Hotels. It has 4 hotels right now, including the first one, which is here in Seattle. Maybe some of you are staying there, or at least you've been there. And if you haven't, I encourage you to walk in there, look around. There's also one in Portland, new ones in New York and Palm Springs, and they're really interesting places. And the folks at Ace have taken these 4 rundown buildings and kind of spit polished them more than refurbished them. The hotels have a lot of well-worn charm. The Seattle hotel is a former maritime flop house. It's on the edge of downtown in Belltown. It's furnished with items from a demolished nursing home and the old Boeing surplus outlet, right? And they've added creative touches. You can see the painting in the back there is from a graffiti artist, a guy named Cause, some of you may have heard of. It's kind of cool, right? The New York hotel, same ideas, a little different feel, but one of the things I love is they use plumbing piping for closets, or instead of closets, for hanging garments, so you can kind of see it off in the corner there. They picked up an 18-foot laboratory work table at a flea market as the public workspace in the lobby. The hotels are kind of hip. They're cool, I guess. I mean, maybe that sounds trendy, but they sort of have the feel of the apartment I wish I had when I was 22. And they've won tons of kudos from the design press. But Ace doesn't have a formal design process that even remotely resembles Lego's. It's more seat of the pants, and that's in large part because it's run by, the company flourishes really on the collective creativity of its leaders. And it's something, they see something at a flea market, for example, and they think it might work, they buy it. And so the point I'm trying to make here is there's no simple formula for design, right? Lego doesn't have it, Ace doesn't have it, neither does Apple, right? I mean, they each follow a path that is best suited for their specific needs, that best match their culture. It doesn't make things easy for companies that want to pursue design as a business strategy, but this isn't easy stuff. But that said, I'm here to tell you that all of these companies have one thing in common. A few things in common. One of them I think is really important. It's that they have a culture that both demands and nourishes great design. And so I'm going to use this quote. John Barrett, who runs Teague, nice good design firm here in Seattle. I talked to them about it, and he said, an iPhone is not a product, it's a manifestation of a culture. And a lot of folks, a lot of executives give this idea lip service. They don't really appreciate how to develop these kind of cultures. The companies that do great design universally have senior executives and CEOs who really embrace the importance of design. They may not be designers themselves, although some are, but they give employees a mandate to take risks in order to come up with the most innovative products. And as I say, it can't be lip service, right? Risks means failing sometimes. And every single company I focus on in the book accepts the occasional failure as the cost of doing business and the cost of being creative. And rather than burying those missteps, they actually surface them. They build them into the company's folklore so that others at the company can learn. And so let's consider another example from my book, because it's kind of fun. It's a company called OXO. I'm guessing some of you have some of their products. They make kitchen products and gardening tools and office supplies. And OXO's modus operandi is addressing pet peeves. They like to say if a consumer doesn't have a pet peeve, they don't have a product. So 15 years ago, the folks at OXO identified a pet peeve that I'm guessing some of you folks still have today. They recognized that most travel coffee mugs spill easily. And the ones that don't are really hard to open and drink from. And so they set out to make a watertight mug that folks could toss into to a bag, and just to make things a little more confusing, at least more convenient, right? They wanted it to be operatable with one finger, so you could, with one hand, so you could open with one hand and drive with the other. It took the company 2 years to come up with the first working prototypes. And the mug had a lever you could squeeze right near the top, and it looked great, and conceptually it seemed just right. And just before these things were about to ship, the CEO went to Taiwan and pulled a few off the production line, the first samples, and he grabbed one and filled it with hot water, and he held it up and pulled the lever, and it worked great. And they thought, some folks might actually want to tip it before they drink it. And so he tilted the mug away from him, pulled the lever, and hot water just soared across the room. And so what happened? Well, it's a lesson in physics, right? If you hold it upright, the steam wants to escape, but there's nothing blocking its way. But you tilt the mug, and water gets in the way of the opening, and it creates this geyser of scalding water. So this thing was a lawsuit waiting to happen. So OXO went back to work. It took them another 6 years before they came up with that. And the key here is the button on top of the mug. By placing it there, users wind up pushing it and then releasing that air pressure before they tilt their mug. And even with the considerable expense of 8 years of development, the mug has paid off. It is consistently one of the top 20 products in OXO's line. They've made their money back and much more. So what's the point of that story? Well, addressing pet peeves is one, and maybe persistence is another. But to me, one of the great lessons here is that OXO didn't sweep that story under the rug, right? They initially failed miserably, but OXO has a culture that openly shares those mistakes, right? It even embraces them. OXO understands that some of the greatest risks end up in failure, but it also understands that some of the greatest failures lead to the biggest insights. Okay, so another common theme I want to get to, and I'm going to wrap up pretty soon here, but is what I would call companies. None of these companies have what I would call the prove-it culture. And this again gets to something Hillel talked about. But one of the biggest impediments to great design are senior executives who say prove it when an underling comes to them with an innovative idea. Now, this isn't to suggest you just throw good business practices out the window, but it's often impossible to prove the business model of a breakthrough product before it launches. And so, as I worked on the book, I talked with Tim Brown, as the CEO of IDEO, and he told me design is about creating new choices, not just choosing from things that already exist. So let's look at another company I focus on, and it's Clif Bar. Now, you might sit there and think, Clif Bar, right? They don't design, right? I mean, that thing's never going to hang on the walls at MoMA, right? But they make energy foods for athletes, right? They use a lot of the tools that I think designers use, right? They do ethnographic research on runners and cyclists and hikers, right? They prototype their products to test their theories, and maybe most important, they trust their instincts, their well-honed instincts. That's what they're good at. So a number of years ago, the folks at Clif were hearing from female athletes who liked the flavor and the texture of Clif Bars, but they didn't want or need all the calories that these bars had, because these bars were they were made for male athletes. And the folks at Clif Bar thought maybe they could come up with a woman-specific bar that had reduced calories, and maybe while they're at it, they'd add some nutrients that women need: iron, folic acid. Now, the prove-it culture would have shot down that idea, right? A women-specific energy bar, there's nothing like it existed at the time. There was no market research that projected sales of the women-specific bar in 5 years or 10 years, right? If anything, market research would have suggested that the women-specific bar would have cannibalized the sales of the original Clif Bar. And in fact, that's actually what their partners were telling them. They said, don't do it. But Clif Bar was getting this feedback from female customers that suggested maybe they could expand the market with a women-specific bar. And what's really important, and again, this Hello talked about this, right? Their instincts supported that. They knew. They're good at design. And so that was the beginning of the Luna Bar. And what's interesting about it is when Clif Bar first launched the Luna Bar, they thought maybe it'd sell 1.5 million bars in the first year. In the first year, they actually sold 10 million bars. And what's really interesting is the Clif Bar itself, the original Clif Bar, just kept going straight through. It didn't miss a beat, kept selling as well. And of course, that's the point, right? Design is about creating great experiences for customers, right? It's about creating a product or a service that they crave. I'd say design is how it works. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.